I'm going to talk to you about the research that we've done on talking about poverty in the UK. So first of all, to say that the Frameworks Institute is a Washington DC based non-profit communications research think tank, which probably doesn't mean anything or help you to understand what we do if you didn't already, but we basically do social science research to find out why people think the things that they think and what changes the things that they think. And we do that using lots of different methods. We've got about 30 social science PhD people who geek out about this stuff. And the project that I'm going to talk to you about today, the research is a kind of 2-year-long research process that we went through here in the UK, working with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others across the poverty sector to really dig into public thinking about poverty in the UK and how we can change the story about it. So first up, I wanted to kind of explore a bit about why framing matters. And I wanted to show you a quote which sums up, for me personally, why I do this work. And it's a quote from George Eliot, who said, "I'll tell you what's the greatest power under heaven, and that is public opinion. The ruling belief in society about what is right and what is wrong, what is honourable and what is shameful. That's the steam that is to work the engines." So I've got a number of quotes like this that I could have shared with you. This is my favourite one for this project because actually this issue of what is right and what is wrong, what is honourable and what is shameful is so pertinent to the story that we need to tell about poverty in order to open people up and to be heard and to be able to advance the kind of solutions that we want to see. But for me this sums up the kind of power of being able to influence public opinion and the fact that if we're trying to seek policy change, we need a kind of bedrock, a foundation of public opinion with us to be able to advance the kind of solutions that we want to see. So, public opinion drives and preserves policy change. And that's the really kind of central idea for our work at Frameworks, that if we're trying to influence the level of systems and policy and really create lasting social change, we need to be thinking about public opinion, public attitudes. And this is our theory of change at Frameworks.
Sorry, Nikki, would it be possible to... Thank you.
Is that okay for the... You don't know?
Oh, no, it's on.
So this is our theory of change. That if we can change the way that we change the way that we communicate, the ideas that we convey, the stories that we tell, the language that we use, and we can shape and influence the public discourse, the narratives that are out there in the media, but also the conversations that people have in real life about these issues. So the conversations that ordinary people have with each other, but also the conversations that a teacher might have with a family or a doctor might have with a patient. And then we need to be able to influence at that level. And by being very intentional about how we communicate and how we talk about these complicated issues like poverty, we can influence at the level of public thinking. So that kind of goes a bit deeper than public opinion. It's how people understand the world in a deep way, as opposed to kind of the level of public opinion, which is more about maybe a snapshot, what people might vote for in a moment or say in answer to an opinion poll. And we're trying to change kind of fundamental understanding about how people think about the world. And that will come through, I hope, in what we explore in poverty. And if we can change public thinking, we can influence policy, both in the short term, but also in the long term, and we can create that kind of fertile ground for lots of different types of policy making to flourish. So it's not really about just kind of one campaign that might influence a particular policy lever, but it's about the foundational frames, the deep ways that we see the world that allow lots of different ideas and campaigns and policy solutions to flourish and to be sustained. And what we talk about when we talk about framing is that framing is all about making choices about how we present information. It's what to emphasise, how to explain something, and what to leave unsaid. And the important thing about framing, for those of you who said, I don't know anything about this, is that it's happening all the time anyway. So we're always framing. And this is all about making conscious, deliberate, evidence-based choices so that we know that the effects of our communications are going to be what we want them to be, rather than using guesswork or gut instinct or maybe some evidence that doesn't give us a complete picture about what might be effective to communicate. So The other reason that framing matters so much is that actually the way that we communicate issues has a very significant effect on how people understand different issues. And to illustrate that, I wanted to show you a clip which has got the title "Understanding is Frame Dependent," which is kind of my geeky colleague's way of saying how you talk changes how people think. Understanding is frame dependent. And this clip has two different people talking about two different issues, and there's a before and an after for each one of them. And it's your job to spot the difference between the before and the after clip.
When somebody's addicted to cigarettes, chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments, the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
So did you spot the difference? Yeah? Okay, so these are two issues on which we've done lots of research. The first one, in terms of how to communicate, the first one is addiction, and the second one is early childhood development and the role of stress, the impact of stress on young children. And what we saw is that the guy in the first clip goes from talking about addiction as being totally driven by choice, all about choice and willpower, to, in his second clip, saying it's all about biology and susceptibility and exposure. In the second one, we saw a woman saying stress is a normal part of development, and then saying actually stress in childhood causes long-term damage. And for those two issues, those are kind of monumental shifts in understanding. And the thing that happens in between these before and after clips is that we read them a short statement, which is well framed, it's been well tested, it's based on our research to change how they think about these issues. And so what we see is the effectiveness of a well-framed statement. But the most interesting thing about that clip is the thing that they both say after, and they're after. Slightly different ways of saying it, but they both do something consistently in the after clip. Did anyone spot that?
I do see, as I said earlier.
Yeah. So he says, as I said earlier, and then says something that is not at all what he said earlier, like the opposite of what he said earlier. And she says, in my opinion before, and in my opinion afterwards. So what do you think that tells us about how aware people are of what for us is a fairly seismic shift in their thinking? They're not aware of it. And that's the power of framing, is that framing is all about allowing people to access and use ways of thinking about issues that they probably have available to them in some way, but they're not defaulting to. So when we map public thinking, we're looking for all the different ways of thinking about an issue, and we're looking to work out what we need, where the productive bits are, where the sweet spots are that we need to be actively cueing to kind of strengthen and make them more likely to think in those ways. So it shows how powerful framing is, because they're so unaware of this shift in their thinking, it just feels like common sense. And that's exactly what we need to be doing when we're communicating difficult issues like poverty and everything else that we work on. So that's kind of at an individual level, and I hope that's convinced you of how awesome framing is. But at a kind of big issue, change over time, social change level, we like to kind of look at where reframing has kind of taken place over time and has been effective in driving transformational change in a lot of different ways. And my favourite one of these is the issue of smoking and tobacco. Because for a long time, smoking was framed as being a personal vice, that people had to, they were either had the willpower to withstand it, or they had to try really hard and quit. But really, it was kind of up to them. And the really big changes happened in how smoking worked as an issue and how likely people were to smoke when the big frame shifted to tobacco being a defective product. So this was the idea that there's something wrong with the product, not something wrong with the people. and that we needed to be protected from that product and the harm it could cause. And that's kind of interesting in terms of what we're trying to do around the debate around poverty and the idea of who's responsible and what's responsible. But if we think about the changes, the big changes that have happened in the last kind of 15 years around smoking, you know, changes in advertising, changes in availability, presentation, marketing, changes in, you know, where people are allowed to smoke, they've had much bigger effects than endlessly chipping away at kind of trying to help people to quit style campaigns, because they focus at that large level than at that small scale level. And the kind of equivalent shift that we're looking for here is to move away from the idea that poverty is a sign of personal failure to the idea that we can change the system to end poverty. And I'm now going to talk to you about how we do that. You'll be glad to know, because it's quite a big challenge. So, to reframe poverty here in the UK, I've got 8 things that we need to do if we've got time for 8. You have to tell me to stop talking now. Okay, so the first one is to understand what you're up against. So when I presented those clips and I talked about those kind of patterns of thinking, we were able to so effectively steer people towards what we wanted them to think because we knew all the different ways that people were likely to interpret information on this issue, and we knew those default beliefs, patterns of thinking, assumptions, at frameworks we call them cultural models. They are basically the kind of broad beliefs in society that we all share, we all have access to, that enable us to make sense of the world around us. So what we've done on poverty is we've mapped those cultural models, those ways of thinking, and what they show us is how easy it is for us to get lost in translation when we're talking about poverty. An example of that is that a campaigner or somebody who's talking about poverty might say something like this: we need to put in measures to support people in poverty so they have opportunities to improve their situation. And this is how this might be interpreted.
Often some people, and I don't know why, I feel sorry for these people, but you help them all the way, but they still can't help themselves. You've got to help yourselves, you've got to help them help themselves. But sometimes it just doesn't, you feel sorry for them.
So it's definitely not the kind of effect that you would want to have with that message. And it's an interesting way that he puts it, because he's sort of being, on the face of it, quite sympathetic, that he's saying some people just can't help themselves, which is not where we want to be taking people when we talk about poverty. Another few ways that people might interpret the message about poverty, in this case one that's really about the kind of urgency and the need to do something. And we're seeing this a lot at the moment. We're seeing really, because this is not inaccurate, there is an urgent need to address poverty. When that situation happens, obviously we want to just tell people how bad the situation is and get that message out. But we find that when this is how you're framing poverty, this can be the way that people respond to that.
I don't think we have this rich fall as much as maybe what it was in the olden days.
I think we're just a more prosperous society, and people say we're poor. They've got mobile phones and flat screen TVs and that sort of thing. I don't think they know the real sense of the real word poverty.
Generally speaking, globally, as obviously the rest of the world is quite the same sense.
So you had a few things going on there, but basically a denial of poverty's existence in the UK at the moment. And taking various different forms and different kind of degrees of offensiveness. But the thing that's consistent here is the thing that matters here is that this is a normal way that people have to think about poverty in the UK. It's easy to see something like that and sort of think or hope that those people might be outliers, they might be the kind of Daily Mail reading people that most people don't think like that. We know from our research that these are very normal ways to think about poverty in the UK, and that we have to be very conscious in how we navigate that strong default way of thinking about poverty. So, the next slide is it's a bit overwhelming, lots of different words on it, but it is the map of how people think about poverty. It's the cultural models, it's the places that people go to and the ways that people interpret information about poverty. So I'm going to talk you through it. So, first thing to point out is that this is how do people think about poverty in the UK. It's not what do people think about poverty in the UK, and that's a really crucial distinction. The how is that we're exploring why people think the things that they think, not just what they might say in a focus group or in a poll at that kind of superficial level. We do long-form interviews where we really interrogate people and we work out. Actually, it might seem that people are saying quite different things when you first ask them about poverty, but there are some common patterns of thinking that really make sense of this at the level of a population. And I've highlighted some of these as kind of red and green, and that's because some of them are ways of thinking about poverty that make it easier for us to communicate the solutions to poverty and the things that we want to change around poverty, and some of them make it a lot harder, and they're really kind of like brick walls in people's thinking. So obviously, we have up here, we have under responsibility, this strong idea around self-makingness. So it's that kind of bootstraps mentality. We all kind of get what we deserve in life, and if something's gone wrong, it's probably because you haven't tried hard enough. And that takes many different forms, but it's very, very common in how people interpret information. And it's what's kind of allowed the sort of scrounger narrative to be so effective in driving policy change. And it's what we're kind of dealing with the picking up the pieces from now. This idea of the culture of poverty, the idea that some people are just born into bad situations and they're born into them and that's just a cycle that will perpetuate. And some people have different values and there's not really much you can do to change that. But to be more positive, people do have the tendency to think about poverty as being something that the government has responsibility to address. So my colleagues in the States tell me that when you do a similar type of piece of research in the States, you never get government responsibility here because people just don't think about the government as having a role in social issues in the way that they do here. So we've got everything to play for and we've got a lot to build on in terms of people's thinking. So nostalgia, this is the idea that kind of, you know, people who are in poverty may be experiencing just a simpler life, free from the kind of the trappings of modern life and that kind of more money, more problems type of thinking. That's obviously not something that we want to be cueing when we're communicating about poverty. So fatalism. Fatalism is one of the biggest threats to all our communications on any issue at any point, because what it means is that you might have got someone to see that something matters, but they are completely incapable of thinking about how it could be solved. And in fact, there's just an abject hopelessness about the idea of anything changing. So I think this is kind of, as a sector, as a kind of, I guess as a sort of civil society, this is the biggest challenge we have, whatever the issue that we're communicating, because so often we're raising awareness of problems and we're talking about how things work, but we're not actually pointing people towards the solutions or increasing people's belief that anything can change. So that's something that we need to be really careful of on poverty. So the two main forms that fatalism can take. Economic naturalism, this is the idea that the economy just is what it is and it just does what it does. It's just a natural entity, it's a bit like gravity, and therefore can't really change how the economy works and the effects that it has on people. The game is rigged is a different way of thinking about the economy and how it works, equally fatalistic, but it takes a different form. And that's the idea that the economy is, and the way the economy and politics works is kind of manipulated via the elites who are simply working on the basis of self-interest, and therefore they're never going to do anything to help the rest of us. So again, kind of cueing that way of thinking can be really challenging if you're actually trying to open people up to change. So context and structure. This is really important because if what we're trying to do is move people away from self-makingness and towards the idea of how people's circumstances affect their lives, this is exactly where we need to be. So opportunity structures is the idea that people have different access to different opportunities, and that has a big effect on how they're able to progress and what they're able to achieve. The spectrum of self-determination is the idea that poverty is not just about going without the basics. It's actually an absence of agency and of the ability to make choices over your own life. So under solutions we have nothing, which is the strong default that people would have. you know, we find out how could poverty be solved, and just blank expressions en masse. Tighten benefits is a strong default people have for solutions, because this sense that people are languishing in poverty because of the benefit system, rather than the benefit system helping people to move out of poverty. So this idea of kind of core or basic support is a response to what's up here, which is this idea of non-negotiable needs. The idea that poverty is about going without the basics. And we saw in the clip the woman who talked about mobile phones and flat screen TVs. That's this sense that we don't really have poverty anymore, because no one is going without the basics, because even people who are poor have these luxury items. So the things people are able to see is the need for core support and a kind of minimum welfare system. Education is another strong default that people have. It's the idea that if you could just tell people how to make their lives better, they will go ahead and make their lives better. So it's a slippery one as solutions go, because it really harnesses that kind of self-makingness. It's just a different way of interpreting that. So under criteria for poverty, we've got the non-negotiable needs, that's going without the basics. We've also got this idea of post-poverty again that we saw, which is that we don't really have poverty in the UK anymore, it doesn't really exist. So that's kind of a bit bleak and probably quite overwhelming, but I have good news, which is that the next stage of our research is all about how we effectively navigate that in order to get people to think about poverty and to think about the solutions of poverty. So everything else that I'm going to say is about moving out of this into a better place in terms of public understanding. So the first recommendation that we have, when it comes to communicating poverty, is that we need to foreground the right issue. So this is kind of vaguely academic in its presentation, but it basically means what are we leading with and what are we making something about when we communicate an issue. There's lots of ways to introduce the idea of poverty, and we wanted to test what we call which issue frame would work, and that's really what is this thing about. And there are kind of three main issue frames on poverty. We can kind of go into poverty through the lens of poverty itself. We can go into poverty through the lens of the economy and what's happening with the economy, and we can go into poverty through the lens of benefits. And what our research showed, I'm going to need to explain to you a bit about how we test different frames. So we have a very rigorous, robust way of gauging the effectiveness of different ways of framing issues. And that is that we test different versions of messages against a control group who hear nothing. So we're really able to say, what's the effect of people hearing this message versus people who heard nothing at all? And on these issue frames, what we found is that when it came to, down here we have the salience importance. This is, do people think poverty is an important issue? The issue frame of poverty had a statistically significant impact on how likely people were to regard poverty as an important issue. The other two frames, benefits and the economy, they don't have a star, which means that they have no statistically significant effects, which basically means, statistically speaking, they're no different to saying nothing at all. So that's not really what you want from communication, is that it's indistinguishable from nothing. On the collective responsibility, which is, how likely do people feel, how likely are people to feel that they have a sense of responsibility around tackling poverty? Do they want to be involved in tackling poverty? Again, the poverty issue frame is the only one that had an improved effect on that. So what this means is that when we talk about poverty, we need to talk about poverty. It sounds really obvious and probably shouldn't have taken us all of that to get to that point. But, sometimes you need to go via a different kind of way of making this kind of big frame around an issue. And so we're confident in saying, and also there's often quite a sense that we can't talk about poverty, and that there's a problem with talking about poverty. And what our research showed very strongly is that if we frame poverty in the right way, we can be effective in talking about poverty and tackling it head on. Okay, so the third of our recommendations is to connect with values. Now, if anyone has kind of done any work on framing or knows anything about framing before today, you'll know that values are really powerful in communicating effectively about an issue. Values are how we get to the heart of why something matters. And on poverty, we need to be able to get beneath all the statistics and get beneath all the kind of evidence that feels so compelling when we're working gathering that evidence, but to people out there can feel a little bit confusing or opaque, and certainly doesn't tell them the story that we're looking to get across. So the values frame on poverty that works is the idea of compassion and justice. So that's the idea that in our society we believe in showing compassion towards others and protecting each other from harm. Yet right now many people live in poverty. We share a moral and social responsibility to ensure that everyone in our country has a decent standard of living. And what this does is it just bypasses some of those really problematic ways of thinking about poverty. So it bypasses self-makingness, cultural poverty, poverty around narcissism, and it makes people more likely to think about poverty as an important issue and one that we all share a responsibility to address. And a few things about this. I think that the thing about values frames is that when we work on an issue, we assume that this is implicit, and we assume, because we feel this, we assume that when we communicate, other people will automatically feel that as well. And what our research on this and lots of other issues suggests is that you need to say it, you need to remind people of the shared values that we hold as a society and why actually this matters at that deep level. Does anyone have a question? You can ask questions, by the way, I'm just throwing them out. Anyone wants to interrupt with a question, that's fine.
Could I ask, have you got any possible to get a copy of your slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't need to take 2 minutes.
No, that's fine. And the thing about this values frame that is so cool, and this isn't always the case, is that it's really flexible and you can kind of articulate it in lots of different ways and with more or less stridency, and you can kind of really dial it up and down. And just to illustrate that, we put together this slide, which is to show a kind of scale of stridency. And you can go from, saying, it's simply not acceptable and we won't stand for this in our society, to saying, slightly more bland statements like, whatever happens as a society, we're in this together. And some of the work that we've been doing with JRF here has been interesting, and might be interesting to you guys as sort of more policy-minded folks, which is around how you frame for policy audiences who, and you're doing a policy briefing, you're probably not going to say any of this stuff. Some people won't, but I can imagine that not many people would. And so you need to get these frames in, you need to get these kind of, these big society ideas in, but you don't want to kind of beat people over the head with it. And one of the things we found is that just being able to say things like, we live in a society where this many people are experiencing poverty or homelessness, and just kind of getting those words in there and just getting, rather than saying this many people are experiencing homelessness, it's just kind of that idea of there is a we around this, there is a society, there is a community. And that can be really powerful in kind of subtly pushing people towards the type of thinking that where we want them to go. So this is my favourite one, number 4, which is no naked numbers. And the little cartoon is we have people arguing about how many. And who here works in any kind of role where they have to generate or communicate statistics? So all of you. And I think that it's one of those areas where we can feel really sure that the meaning that we have around those statistics and those numbers is what other people will take from them. And there's so much research that shows the effect of kind of naked numbers and just the facts that shows that there's so much interpretation that happens. There's several different things that can happen when people are kind of hit with big numbers. It's 1, they don't understand them. 2, they completely just put up a wall. And 3, they interpret them. They're active in thinking about what they mean, but they interpret them to mean the exact opposite thing to the thing that you think they mean. So we have to frame. This is not about not using data, it's not using facts. Facts are really important, but we have to frame our facts. And to convince you of this, I have another one of our survey experiment graphs, which is the effects of poverty data, so naked numbers around poverty, versus poverty data framed with the compassion frame. And what we see is that there are significant differences in how people respond to those numbers, depending on how you frame them. And what they're doing, what the compassion frame is doing here, is moving people's thinking in the direction that we want it to go. So it's making people more likely to think that poverty exists. It's making people feel more of a sense of collective responsibility. It's making people more likely to embrace our definition of poverty, which is around kind of relative poverty rather than absolute poverty. And it's making people feel a sense of collective efficacy. So when we think back to how dominant that fatalistic thinking is, this is really important. This is the idea that this is a problem that can be solved and that we can solve it collectively. So if we're able to actually shift that, that's really powerful and necessary in communicating poverty. Okay, so the next recommendation is around metaphors. So we love metaphors at Frameworks, and before I worked at Frameworks, I was a little bit kind of intrigued by the obsession with metaphors. And now I'm part of the gang, I know what it's all about, and I can see just why metaphors are so important. And that's because they restructure thinking. They give people different ways to think, and they make the type of thinking that we're trying to advance much more easy and automatic. They're also really memorable. So when we do this testing, and we see what type of language and what type of ideas work to get the results that we want to get, if we then go back 6 months or a year later, if it's been a metaphor that we've used, that's much more likely to have stuck in someone's head. So they're really, really powerful in creating a lasting change in thinking. And then 2 metaphors that work on poverty. The first one is about being locked or trapped in poverty, and the second one is about currents and a kind of water-based, tidal type thinking about how people can get caught up in poverty. Now, what these are both doing, there's a common feature of these metaphors. They're spatial metaphors, and they allow people to think in terms of space and giving people a very clear picture of how something works. But there's a common feature, and that is that they are making the things that are outside of the individual an unavoidable, inescapable part of that mental picture. So it's very difficult to think about poverty in terms of self-makingness when you're thinking about poverty using these metaphors. So they're really, really powerful of just kind of bypassing that idea of self-makingness. So I'm going to show you, you saw a couple of clips earlier of people's kind of default ways of thinking about poverty, and this next clip is people talking about poverty once they've been exposed to one or both of these metaphors.
So tell me, what did you take away from that? What point do you think it was trying to make?
It reduces your options by falling into poverty level. You know, you don't get to do what you want to do. You don't get to make a contribution to society. It's demeaning.
Being stuck within a system you can't get out of.
So everyone's got personal needs, so they still need some kind of cash payment, so they've got that like freedom as well.
If you suppress or make people feel so grateful for small things that you are limiting people's ability to be the best that they can be. And if they're best, then that helps for society, that helps GDP, that helps everything.
Everyone's got the ability to bring something to society, and you need to support everybody to give them the best chance to do that.
If you want a collective society to function and to flourish, and all of the economic growth that comes from that, you've got to give people the tools, and sometimes that's benefits.
Giving people the chance to, or at least the foundation to kind of go on from there.
Well, it brings you up to a standard of life where you have choices.
Making sure that if people are having a rough time, whether it's beginning of life or above, that there is a system there to kind of help you, that's not making you fall. Or will support you a little bit, and you've got to reach out and help yourself. But we as a society won't let you fall through the cracks.
So did everyone spot the type of language that was being used there that was really consistent with this idea of the spectrum of self-determination? It was about agency, control over your life, ability to contribute. It wasn't reducing poverty to being about kind of a basic level of income or a basic kind of standard of life. It was actually about how able to be themselves and to be contributing to society people are. And that's exactly where we want to be taking people and thinking about poverty. It isn't just this transactional thing, it's actually bigger than that. So since we completed this research and started presenting it, we've had a lot of uptake in terms of people using these framing recommendations. In fact, this was the day that we launched the research. Joseph Franchi Foundation had a quote in the Times which was using the trapping metaphor. And what we're finding a lot is that because it's such vivid language and strong language and emotive language, it's being pulled into the headlines, which is great, because when we think about how we need to get these ideas out again and again and again in order to kind of drip, 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 drip into people's thinking, that's exactly the effect that we need to have. So subsequently we've seen quite a lot more of this happening. This was, I think, a couple of days ago in one of your newspapers, and we've had other kind of national media successes with these metaphors at the UK level. What's even more exciting is that these are journalists using these metaphors without being prompted. So that shows that this idea of influencing and kind of infiltrating the public discourse is starting to happen through repetition of these ideas, and also because that's accurate. It's an accurate way to describe how the effects of poverty. It's actually starting to kind of influence spontaneous reporting of these issues.
Can I ask, journalists could choose to use certain words because of the way that they actually want to frame it. So what you've got there are two decisions to frame it that way as opposed to frame it as a different problem. The politics behind the newspaper
Yes.
could influence what they choose.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can't imagine, for example, the Telegraph perhaps using that terminology, unless you've got an example, which would be fantastic.
So that's a really good question. What we find is that generally people are more susceptible to being framed than you would imagine they are. And that actually people are so predispositions and kind of existing ways of thinking and political inclinations are definitely real, but the power and the effects of those are equivalent to the power of framing. So I think that I don't think we have yet managed to get a Telegraph journalist to use one of these metaphors in a headline, but I wouldn't be surprised if that did happen.
Okay.
Something to aim for.
Could I pick up on something about that? My background's in psychology, and I know there's been a lot of research, and obviously, giving people a statement or exposing somebody to a visual cue or whatever, and people are then predisposed to repeat it back as usually talking about. But I'm hoping to be convinced to somebody who thinks what you're saying is spot on in the short term.
Yeah.
I'm hoping to convince them about the power of this to facilitate perhaps longer term change. And I can see the role of the media in doing that, but given that people are constantly being exposed to other frames, and also what we know about people's desire to please, and in order to say something that perhaps the interviewer has just begged to them and to repeat it back to them. I just wondered what evidence there is about longer term shifts.
That's a great question, and I think probably a good moment to explore that. So the science shows that you need a dose, you need a repeat kind of prescription of these frames. Some frames are more sticky than others, which means they're more memorable. Like the metaphors, people are more likely to remember following just one dose, further down the line. But generally, framing's a contest, and we need to keep getting the same messages or different versions of the same messages out repeatedly for them to have that lasting impact on thinking. And that's where you see kind of effective campaigns and movements that have found ways to reiterate different versions of the same thing over and over again in order to really affect thinking. And I could come up with a couple of examples, but perhaps we can talk about that.
And you've done that, the smoking tobacco one.
Yeah. And there's more recent ones as well. If you look at Brexit, Brexit is a case study in values framing, because it's all about freedom and control, and it was consistently about freedom and control throughout the referendum campaign. And then even now, it's still about freedom and control, and it's the EU that's kind of trapping us and denying us that freedom and control. So it's a values frame that is repeated over and over again, although articulated in different ways, and that really has affected how people think about the EU and about our role within it.
Yeah, that's a really good example of the point that you're making, because it doesn't actually, implicit in that should be the question, who's control? But because that's not been made explicit, people are making all sorts of assumptions. Come back to your point about making things explicit.
So the frame is very powerful in creating the nebulousness of the thinking that they're looking for, which is just about a desire to escape from this thing. So on to the next recommendation, which is around benefits. So lots and lots of debate at the moment around how we talk about benefits and what's happening with the benefit system. And we struggled to find effective ways of framing benefits, and one of the outcomes we were looking for is that we wanted to be able to talk about poverty and benefits in such a way that made people more supportive of a more robust benefit system. And that was a hard thing to do because of everything that we were up against in the framing contest and in the kind of public narrative that we were working in. And what the big finding here is that we need to, as a bit of a light bulb moment during our research, we need to position benefits as a solution, not as a problem. So, this is a statement which is, I'll read it to you. In our society, we believe in showing compassion towards others and helping protect each other from harm. Yet cuts to benefits have left millions of people struggling to get by, creating a great deal of suffering. We have a moral responsibility to strengthen our benefit system so that all people in our country have a decent standard of living. Now, that's almost right, because it has the values frame really, really strongly articulated in terms of in our society, compassion, and then the moral responsibility. That's exactly where it should be. But when we tested this, there were no statistically significant effects on public thinking as a result of that, and it's because of the way that we introduced and framed the idea of benefits. So what we need to do is position benefits as a solution to a problem rather than a problem in and of themselves. And this is really hard when there are problems with the benefit system that we need to draw attention to. But if we can start from the point of view that we're reminding people of why benefits exist in the first place and the fact that actually people do fundamentally support a welfare system. So when we tested the effects of communicating benefits as a problem and the cuts to benefits as a problem versus introducing the idea of people being constrained by poverty and benefits being something that can help loosen those constraints, these were the effects. So benefits as a problem, no statistically significant effects on any of those outcomes that we were looking for. So again, it's no better than saying nothing at all. May as well just not open your mouth. When we position benefits as a problem, as the solution, to a problem, we have these quite big, good, statistically significant effects on all of those measures. And actually, I think one of the other measures that this was successful around was actual support for benefits itself. So it's not on the graph for some reason, but it helps people to think, yes, I want to support a more robust benefit system. So we were pleased with that. So just to sum up what that looks like, this is the before. This is kind of how we might default to talking about a benefit system, particularly around universal credit. This is kind of something I'm seeing a lot of, is that the benefit system is broken and must be fixed. Benefits are vital for people in poverty, and we need to stop cutting or stop making a mess out of the benefit system. And we need to change it to we can solve poverty by loosening its grip on people. Benefits help release people from the restrictions our economy places on them, such as low pay and high housing costs. So it's really about locating benefits within a broader picture of poverty and the economy. And there's another thing to mention here, which I haven't got a slide on, which is there were two things that worked really powerfully when communicating benefits. The second one was about reminding people that benefits are part of a broader system of public services. So actually saying we all rely on public services day to day, like the NHS, like roads and railways, and actually benefits is just one of the public services that we all rely on, and it's particularly important for people in need. And just being able to frame benefits as something that is a public good and is there for all of this made a big difference in terms of people's response. And again, it's the same thing as I said with the values frame. It's kind of reminding people of what you might think everyone should think anyway, but you kind of need to tell them and you just need to prompt that.
Does a comparison with a broken system help? So if we said, health insurance in the US and how that works,
So generally talking about broken systems is not something we recommend because it can really point people towards fatalism. And so I think we wouldn't ever recommend talking about a broken system because once you use those words, it's very vivid and you're just kind of like, well, what can you do? Even if you're arguing against having a broken system. You see what I mean? Okay, so show people in context. So this is a little cartoon doodle that someone at JRF came up with that illustrates the trapped in poverty metaphor nicely. But it also illustrates this idea of being able to, when we talk about individuals and their stories and the journeys that people are going through and the situations that they're in, don't leave out the things that are around them. And this is a really, really big challenge, especially when you're kind of using news media and people with lived experience of poverty to tell their story, is that it's so tempting for them to just focus on the very specific, narrow focus of their story, but actually being able to explain how the circumstances around them affected their journey makes it a much more powerful story to tell. So my little kind of mental shortcut for this is that we need to move from talking about choices to talking about options. So when we talk about choices, even if we're saying people don't have any choices or people are left with no choice, that word choice is activating the idea of choice. And it's activating this idea that the woman expressed so nicely at the beginning of people are choosing to have mobile phones, they're choosing to have widescreen TVs. Whereas if we talk about options, that's about what's outside of people, it's about what's available to them, it's not about their kind of internal decision making and the idea that that might be judged. Right, this is my 8th and final recommendation, which is about telling a shared story. So often we find that on issues like poverty and everything else that we work on, there's a kind of really strong recognition that we need to get out there and we need to communicate and we need to tell people what's going on. And there's lots of work happening that's good work, but what it's doing in terms of the overall story that people hear is this. It's competing, contrasting stories that don't create for a kind of coherent overall narrative or understanding of an issue. And we find this on most of the issues that we work on when we analyse what's going on in the media and what different organisations are saying, is that there isn't a coherence to it. And this is not a framing strategy like the one we're presenting, is not about everyone having to say exactly the same thing in exactly the same words all the time. But it's about moving from that to this, so that we're working together to advance the same kind of core ideas and to move in a kind of mutually reinforcing direction rather than just to be creating incoherence and confusion. So I presented this to some groups that we're working with in Australia, and this brilliant woman came up with a lovely way of, slightly offensive way of summarising this. She said that we need to move from cacophony to symphony, which I really like, because I think when we work together we can be like a symphony and we can be effective. So that's it for my recommendations. We've got a short kind of exercise to work through together, but we're going to do questions first.
Yep.
Can I sit down for them?
Yes, I'll turn this on.